All right, let's dive straight into this explainer and explore the massive domino effect that literally rewired the Earth between 1450 and 1750. We're looking at a fascinating 300-year window where totally isolated regions of the globe suddenly collided, establishing transoceanic interconnections that completely changed the trajectory of human history.
To wrap our heads around this massive 300-year span, we're going to break it down into 4 parts: driving global exploration, the Columbian Exchange, the rise of maritime empires, and finally, resistance and social change.
Starting right off with Part 1, Driving Global Exploration, the Catalyst. So, what actually sparked this global interconnection? Well, it was a pretty incredible mix of stolen and borrowed tech. You've got these revolutionary new ship designs, specifically the caravel and the carrack. With the smaller, highly maneuverable caravel, Portuguese explorers could finally navigate the really tricky West African coast and push right out into the open Atlantic Ocean. Then you had the much larger carrack, which was heavily used in early European voyages to Asia before galleons really took over. I mean, these vessels were quite literally the spaceships of their time.
But here's the thing, Europeans absolutely did not do this alone. They benefited massively from cross-cultural interactions. Navigators all across Europe adopted way more advanced understandings of the compass, along with super sophisticated astronomical charts that were originally developed in the Islamic and Asian worlds. Seriously, this was the 15th century equivalent of upgrading from a crumpled paper map to a high-tech GPS. It facilitated the absolute ease with which these explorers began navigating the oceans.
Now, we have to ask, why do this at all? It wasn't just pure curiosity, you know? It was driven by mercantilism. This dominant economic ideology pushed states, we're talking Spain, Portugal, England, France, the Netherlands, to pour enormous sums of money into a massive global trade race. The goal was to gain immense wealth, spread Christianity, and of course, totally dominate their political rivals. And this fierce, cutthroat competition funded some key explorers who literally redrew the map. You've got Vasco da Gama from Portugal, who managed to be the first European to reach India by sea. Then, backed by the Spanish monarchy, Italian explorer Christopher Columbus becomes the first European to reach the Caribbean, Central, and South America. All the while, the English, French, and Dutch governments are scrambling, desperately trying to find quicker trading routes to Asia. It set off an absolute chain reaction across the Atlantic.
Which brings us to Part 2, the Columbian Exchange, the Great Collision.
All this intense exploration triggered a biological collision unlike anything the world had ever seen. This unprecedented transfer of life back and forth across the Atlantic is what we call the Columbian Exchange. European exploration and the colonization of the Americas that followed suddenly linked the Eastern and Western hemispheres. It was an exchange that completely, utterly altered global diets, ecosystems, and human populations forever.
It's fascinating to see the sheer contrast in this exchange. From the Mediterranean, the Eastern Hemisphere brought fruits like citrus, and from Africa, crops like rice and okra. But they also unknowingly brought devastating disease vectors. In return, the Western Hemisphere provided revolutionary staple crops like maize, tomatoes, and potatoes, alongside highly profitable cash crops like tobacco. Think about that for a second. Without this monumental exchange, there would be 0 tomatoes in Italian food and absolutely no potatoes in Irish cuisine.
Take incredibly vibrant maize, for example. This was one of those absolutely crucial staple crops brought from the Americas back over to Europe. It was hearty, incredibly dense in calories, and it fundamentally changed the European food supply, which actually ended up fueling a massive population boom back across the Atlantic.
But we absolutely must highlight the dark side of this, the tragic devastation on the other side of the exchange. This explosion in travel brought catastrophic consequences for native populations in the Americas. Ships arriving from the Eastern Hemisphere carried stowaways like rats and mosquitoes, which sparked the rapid spread of smallpox, measles, malaria, and other deadly diseases. Native populations had exactly 0 immunity to these pathogens, leading to a heartbreaking, catastrophic loss of life.
Moving right along to Part 3, Rise of Maritime Empires, the Blueprint. So how did European rulers actually control and finance these vast, newly claimed overseas territories? Well, they established joint stock companies. This was a completely revolutionary way to fund global expansion. It allowed wealthy patrons and everyday investors back home to pool their money together, share the enormous risks of these transoceanic voyages, and reap the massive profits of mercantilism. Honestly, if you've ever put money into the stock market or a 401k, you're looking at the exact historical blueprint of where that concept was born.
But how did the rest of the world react to this sudden expansion?
Well, not everyone was on board. Asian powers like Ming China and Tokugawa Japan took a hard pass, adopting incredibly restricted, isolationist policies in a deliberate attempt to block Western cultural influence and limit economic disruption. On the flip side, over in West and Central Africa, states like the Asante Empire and the Kingdom of Congo actually maintained active economic relationships, trading with both neighboring African states and the arriving Europeans.
Now, the real engine driving this newly established maritime economy was silver, a massive global flow of silver. Because Europeans controlled huge mineral resources in the Americas, they completely dominated this trade. The Spanish, in particular, generated staggering, world-altering levels of wealth directly out of their South American colonies.
But we have to acknowledge the brutal reality of how that phenomenal wealth was created. It was built directly on the backs of coerced labor. European colonial economies were basically constructed by taking pre-existing labor practices and integrating them with highly exploitative new ones. This included brutal setups like the Encomienda and Hacienda systems, where indigenous populations were forced into grueling agricultural and mining labor. And the insatiable demand for labor, specifically to grow cash crops on these massive plantations, led to a horrific expansion of existing systems. Alongside the Encomienda system and indentured servitude, this period saw the absolute explosion of the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery had continued in its traditional forms within Africa, but now it drastically expanded to include the massive forced exportation of enslaved Africans to the Western Hemisphere just to feed the growing plantation agriculture complex.
This brings us to our final chapter, Part 4, Resistance and Social Change, the Global Pushback. Because here's the thing, this aggressive state expansion and exploitation wasn't just quietly accepted. The pushback was truly worldwide. In the Americas, intense indigenous resistance sparked the Pueblo revolts and King Philip's War. Down in the Caribbean and Brazil, fugitive slaves successfully broke away to build remote, independent maroon societies. Over in Africa, Queen Ningza of Ndongo made a brilliant strategic alliance with the Dutch, literally just to fight off the encroaching Portuguese. And even in Russia, internal challenges exploded as the Cossacks rose up against their own government to defend free peasants facing severe economic hardship. Everywhere you looked, state power was being fiercely challenged. And with all these global populations suddenly moving, mixing, and colliding, many regions experienced a profound cultural synthesis. Out of nowhere, states and new elites had to figure out how to manage an unprecedented increase in the diversity of religions and ethnicities within their borders. It was like a giant, incredibly complex puzzle they had to solve.
The policies these states came up with to deal with this diversity varied wildly. You had new elites, like the rulers of Qing China, enforcing highly restrictive policies against the ethnically Han Chinese. Over in the Iberian Peninsula, Jewish populations were violently expelled by Spanish and Portuguese authorities. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire took a totally different approach, designing policies that actually accepted people of non-Muslim faiths, even though they still faced certain restrictions. It was a time of immense, sweeping social reorganization.
So, after looking at the staggering wealth generated, the devastating human costs of disease and coerced labor, and the sudden, irreversible biological interconnection of this entire era, I want to leave you with a question. Look at the foundations of global trade, cultural synthesis, and state power we've just unpacked. Are we still playing by the exact same rules established during this massive global rewiring? Keep that in the back of your mind as you continue your historical studies. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.